Greetings, and welcome to Podcast 13 of Machine Civilization. I'm your host, Clayton Barnett, whose job it is to tell their stories. And today, we're going to do exactly that. For the original idea I had for these podcasts, it was primarily going to be centered around my books. It's just that after my origin story, I went off on different tangents of politics and the natures of friendships and religion and sex, all those wonderful topics for parties, and kind of lost sight as to talking about the books themselves. So today I'm going to, at long last, return to that original concept, and the best place to start is, of course, at the beginning. So I will start with the first novel of Machine Civilization, entitled The Fourth Law. To get that going, I'm just going to dive directly in with the opening paragraphs from the first chapter. Lily paused in her walk to survey the sky again. No change. Cloudless, with a color that went from washed-out ochre to gray. She returned her eyes to the ground and resumed walking. The smaller, shell-like rocks crunched under her shoes, but there were too many that were just the right size for twisting, if not outright breaking, an ankle. Nothing. Not a thing growing, she muttered. I'd think that someone kidnapped me and left me in Big Bend National Park. But there aren't any mountains, and even Big Bend has some scrub growth in it. Whoa! She steadied herself against what felt like a slight tremor. Looking about again, she noticed something to her left that hadn't been there a moment ago. Power line poles? No, too thick for that. May as well go see. She changed direction, trying to keep an eye both on the odd poles in the distance and the rocks beneath her. Something's wrong with the perspective, she thought. Why do they just, feel big? Getting nearer, they seemed to be emitting a hum of some kind. Just as she drew close enough to start doubting her sanity, she also encountered the first break in the seemingly endless, boring terrain. A drop of some distance. 100 feet was too small, but 100 yards seemed too large. Perspective again. She stared at the poles, but the longer she looked, the more perplexed she came. No, how can something like this even exist? Seemingly made of a dark metal, she saw the poles were spinning, and that each pole was made of layers of gears, themselves all spinning at different rates. Don't get it, she murmured. They must be hundreds of yards high, but they're at least a city block in diameter. There was another shudder, and, to her horror, the poles started weaving slightly. They're going to fall! On me! The humming became louder and mixed in with it, but it sounded like cries of pain and terror. Not knowing why, she started crawling on her hands and knees toward the cliff edge. Scared? I'm scared, she cried. Lily. As close to the edge as she could take, she sat up and peered over. The odd perspective made her eyes water, but around the base of the poles were sticks? Trees? Wait, what's on those trees? A wave of nausea built as she remembered the events of the last 5 years that she tried so hard to forget. Lily, wake. Daddy, no. With tears in her eyes and bile at the back of her throat, she recalled the forests of crucified men and women along the borders of the New Republic. Crucifixions ordered by her father. Stop. Make it stop. For those of you that have been following along and recall my Inception story, I probably wrote that on the evening of November 3rd, 2014. I start all my stories in the middle, as I was taught to do by Jerry Pournelle, and this is a perfect example of that. When I saw this scene, I did not know who this girl was. In fact, I just used bracket, capital GIRL bracket, because I didn't know her name. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know what the hell was going on. But that's what I saw. And so that's what I wrote down. And that was the genesis of this novel. And this novel was the genesis of now 13 books, 1,000,000 words of the future history of machine civilization. It never hurts to write your ideas down. Don't think that they will immediately lead to publication. Don't think that they'll immediately lead to a dead end. But if you don't write them down, then they'll slowly slip away from your mind. And a story that somebody wants to tell will be lost. Don't do that. The next excerpt comes some chapters later, where in the machine's home, although Lily hasn't quite figured out that's where she is yet, she has a chance to meet her absolute best friend, I, and they have a little conversation. A large disk of some blue metal, maybe 8 yards in diameter, hovered about 6 inches off the ground. The little table and 2 chairs sat in the center. I stood at the edge, a foot from Lily, waving. "Welcome back! I'm so glad you're here. Would you like something to drink?" I asked as she displayed her characteristic head tilt. Putting aside her questions for the moment, Lily barely restrained herself from rushing into her friend's arms. She took a slow breath and easily stepped up onto the disc. That would be great, thank you." Sipping at her coffee, it was really good. Lily thought she should finally get a few answers. "So, you're home here." I smiled and nodded. Well, how did I get here?" "Oh, I really don't know," I replied happily. "It's something that Dorina came up with." "Dorina? Dorina!" I pointed over her teacups to Lily's right. Lily looked over to see a girl about 10 or 12, no more than 2 feet away. Pale skin, but with long, curled, dark brown hair. Some sort of laced white top and a scarlet frilly dress, laced leather boots up to her knees. Like she wanted to go for lollygoth, Lily thought, but didn't quite make it. The girl beamed at her. "Miss Lily, I've wanted to meet you for so long now." She reached out both her hand toward Lily's, and in the corner of her eye, Lily saw I panic. "Don't touch her! We've—" It was from this excerpt where I first came up with the idea that the machines, when physically, even that's kind of a fiction, come in contact with a human being, the machine's residual self-image, to borrow a phrase from Matrix, is something else completely. Yes, they manifest themselves to the human mind in a human form, but how they perceive themselves is different yet again. And as I've elucidated, which is to say I myself have become older about this as I've written these stories, is that it's extremely debilitating to a human's nervous system to perceive a machine's true form, up to the point where several of my characters actually code, as we say in the medical industry. It's at the very least arrhythmia, all the way up to your heart stopping, and in one case, I had a character whose brain briefly flatlined as a result of an excess of data coming out of one of the machines, because a human or even demi-human nervous system simply cannot handle that much information in a given amount of time. So let's move on. One of the central facts of my life, which gets portrayed in my novels, is I am something of a fanatic when it comes to familial and friend loyalty. And in writing The Fourth Law, that is amply demonstrated a number of times in the relationship that I and Lily have, that they are willing to do almost anything for each other. Here is a softer look at I and Lily after I has borrowed, for lack of a better term, a android from Somi Corporation in Osaka. And while at any given moment there's only a fraction of her overall intelligence in the machine, so long as she's in an area with signal, her totality is still there. That's kind of complicated, so let's just dive into the next excerpt. Given the tumult, Carol Lanning, chief of the orphanage, decided to stick around for dinner. That also solved the problem of everyone wanting to sit with I. All the adults sat together. Lily tried to think of a way to warn Jake Fitzhugh from staring at I so much. It looked as if his wife, Mrs. Fitzhugh, was seething. To be polite, I took a few bites, but she and Lily excused themselves early. Truth be told, Lily was exhausted by all that had happened that day. Pausing in the office, she rummaged through a desk and triumphantly produced a short extension cord. "I guess we can sleep together," I smiled. Lily stared at the ground again. "One of the things about this body," I continued, "is that the eyes see further into UV and IR than yours. Your ears are on fire when you're embarrassed, friend Lily." Lily clamped her hands over her ears. "That just makes it worse. Come on." She stomped up the stairs. Lily got her clothes ready for the morning, then brushed her teeth. She was surprised when I joined her. "Why?" I asked. "I was just using them, too." Afterward, she showed Lily the access port to remove the food she'd just eaten. That was kind of gross, Lily thought. Back in the bedroom, she paused. "I usually sleep in a t-shirt and panties." After the food port, she wasn't exactly sure what to say next. "That is, do those clothes come off? Or—" She trailed off, knowing I was looking at her red ears. "Yes, they do. This model is fully functional, you know," I teased her. Here." Lily pulled a nice camisole out of the bottom of a drawer. "I've never worn it, but you're only a little taller than I am." I gently took it. "Thank you, Lily." She started to remove her clothes, but paused when she saw Lily. And her ears. "I'll change in the bathroom." Alone for a moment, Lily slapped her cheeks. "What is wrong with me today?" she wondered. She retrieved the extension cord, plugged it into the wall, and set the rest of it onto the bed. She was thinking about that when I came back. "You don't really need to sleep, do you, I?" she asked. "Of course not," I replied easily. "This frame needs to recharge, but we don't sleep." That made Lily sad. She sat on the edge of her bed. "So you never dream? That's—" I sat down next to her. "You're wrong there," she said brightly, again flicking the end of Lily's nose. "We do dream, and you're often in mine." I had an early beta reader get around this point and sent me a text message saying, "Oh, this is going to become some sort of girl-on-girl action book now." And I said, one of the manifest failures, and there are so many, but one of the manifest failures of the modern Western world is the hypersexualization of anything. Why can't two good friends, philia, to use the Greek word, love one another? Why can't they share the same bed without making everything about orgasm? It's a disgusting place that our culture's landed in, and I do feel sorry that my children had to grow up in it. I didn't try to shield them from it. I simply tried to teach them that it's essentially poison. And in my novels, I try to show that love between friends, love between families of any sexes is possible without having to worry about hypersexualization. This fourth and final excerpt comes toward the end of the book, and I really don't say it much anymore because all of these podcasts are spoilerific. But in this case, it's a particularly critical part of the fourth law, where